Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. Before I introduce our next episode of the Authority File, I want to remind our listeners that we have a brand new podcast out. It's called Patron Driven, and it's a narrative-style podcast that brings you crowdsourced library stories where the personal meets the professional. Our first story is a 5-part series that follows 4 librarians through the destruction of the Lone Star College Kingwood Library after Hurricane Harvey in 2017, and the 2 years it took to rebuild. Patron Driven is out now, wherever you get your podcasts. In this episode, however, we're going to be talking about the future of vocational education. My guest is Dr. Rupert Maclean, an internationally renowned researcher, author, and consultant on technical and vocational education and training. Dr. Maclean, based in Australia, currently divides his time between Melbourne, where he is an adjunct professor in the School of Education at RMIT University, and Hobart in Tasmania, where he runs the Education Innovation for Development Consultancy. He has been a chair professor of international education at the Hong Kong Institute of Education and a director at UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, among many other higher education and international agency positions. Dr. Maclean has also produced an incredible volume of research on education, including Education for the Changing World of Work, with a special focus on technical and vocational education. He has developed 2 international handbooks, the 6-volume Handbook of Education for the Changing World of Work and the Handbook of Technical and Vocational Education and Training and Research, and he's the editor or co-editor of 3 international book series, all of which have been published by Springer Nature, the sponsor of this episode. In this 4-episode series, Dr. Maclean and I talk about some of the defining moments of his tenure at UNESCO, the impacts on the world of work due to the shift from manufacturing to the information age, global trends in technical and vocational education, and why countries must provide equitable access to education. In this first episode, Dr. Maclean talks about his professional upbringing, and you'll get a taste of the vast amount of research he's published. All right. Well, Rupert, welcome to the program. We're happy to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
All right. To start, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? You've certainly got an interesting background in both higher education and international agency work, particularly with UNESCO.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm Australian by nationality, and in terms of my schooling, my own schooling, all done in Australia, primary, secondary schooling. And then I myself became a secondary school teacher. Mm-hmm. And having worked as a secondary school teacher for a couple of years and doing further study, I then became a university academic, working mainly in the sociology of education and in teacher education. After working as an academic for some years, I then got a position with UNESCO. I first of all worked for UNESCO in Burma or Myanmar on a project to upgrade teacher education throughout the country. And then I enjoyed that work, so I then got a permanent position with UNESCO. And I had postings in various countries, in Bangkok, in Myanmar, in Paris, in Bonn in Germany. And in that job, I was traveling a great deal. I mean, I'd be traveling twice a month to different countries, mm-hmm. helping them when it came to strengthening and upgrading their schooling systems and education systems. And then after working for UNESCO for some 18 years, I then went back to academic work, and I was working in Hong Kong as the chair professor in international education. And then more recently, I was working in Doha in Qatar as a UNESCO chair in education. And along the way, when I was in Hong Kong, I established my own consultancy company called Education Innovation for Development Consultancies. So currently I'm back in Australia. I'm based in Australia. I have a position at RMIT University in Melbourne in the education faculty. I also have a number of adjunct positions in different countries, in Hong Kong, in Malaysia, and so on. And I also work through my consultancy company on various projects to do with education as a form of development in terms of education development and social development.
Okay, excellent. So I'm wondering if maybe just to get into a little bit more detail about what UNESCO does and what you did while you were there. And, perhaps if you could, just look back and talk a little bit about some of the defining moments during your tenure there.
Okay. Well, UNESCO was actually established after the Second World War,
Hmm.
established in 1945. It has 193 member states or countries, and the whole purpose of UNESCO, and the reason why it was established after the Second World War, is peace building. How can we try and make sure that we develop a more peaceful world than has been the case, particularly during the Second World War? So it tries to do this through education. The Constitution says that war begins in the minds of men and women, and
Hmm.
therefore the defences to achieve peace must also be developed in their minds. And therefore, what UNESCO tries to do is meet the learning needs of all children, youth, and adults. It's the main UN agency concerned with education and schooling. Other agencies like UNICEF are also concerned with education and schooling, but only for particular age groups. UNESCO is all the way through from primary and early childhood, primary, secondary, tertiary, and so on. And not
Hmm.
just education in the formal academic sense, but it's concerned with training, with looking at the preparation of people for gainful employment, for example. So that's the sort of background for UNESCO. Now, although education is the fundamental focus of UNESCO, it's also concerned with the social sciences, with the natural sciences. It's concerned with the freedom of information flow, freedom of the press, and things of that type, and it's concerned with culture. Which is the gives a key aspect of the identity of populations in different countries. So the World Heritage, for example, um, is part of the mandate of UNESCO.
Okay. So again, what were, as when you were with UNESCO, can you talk a little bit about some of the specific things or trends that you were dealing with in terms of working with different countries in sort of developing their educational foundations?
Sure. Well, when I worked for UNESCO, I initially worked in Myanmar or Burma on a
Hmm.
project to upgrade teacher education throughout the country. And then I moved to a permanent position in UNESCO Bangkok, where I was chief of the a centre promoting educational innovation for development throughout the Asia Pacific region. And this was in areas like primary education, teacher education, secondary education, but also key aspects like improving teaching modalities, looking at the content of education, including areas like values education and so on. Um, and then I was involved as the in UNESCO Paris for a period, where I was director of secondary education on an international basis. And
Right.
then I was the foundation director for a new centre established in Bonn in Germany, which is concerned with improving the bridge between education, training, and the world of work. How can we better equip people to achieve gainful employment? What contribution does education and schooling have um, to enabling people to have the necessary skills to achieve gainful employment, particularly at a time of major economic and social change, because things are moving so quickly. People are going to be entering jobs that haven't been invented yet. So, how do we do things like lifelong learning, independent learning, and so on to enable people to keep up to date on the sort of developments occurring in the labour force requirements and have the repertoire of skills required to be able to get a job and be able to be successful in their various areas of employment?
Right. So what was that like, moving from, one country to the next, and sort of assisting them with what you've just described? Um, were you taking the same concepts with you into each of the countries, or were you kind of um, modifying things as you went along and
Mm-hmm.
depending on sort of the situational
Yeah.
aspects of each of those countries?
Mhm. Well, UNESCO has its headquarters in Paris, but
Hmm.
then has offices in various countries throughout the world. All the member states of UNESCO, 193 member states, meet on a regular basis to discuss what they regard as being the major education and schooling needs within their
Right.
individual countries, but also what are the global trends. And they might decide, for example, that gender issues are extremely important and we must do more to assist girls and women when it comes to their education. They
Mm-hmm.
may decide that teacher education is fundamentally important, that the quality of any education system depends ultimately upon the quality of the teaching that occurs, and therefore attracting the most suitable people into the occupation and enabling them to have a necessary repertoire of skills. They might be concerned with science education, increasingly with environmental education. So there's a whole range of issues that are important to them. And then some countries have specific needs, for example, the education of refugees or child soldiers in countries like Myanmar and Iraq and Afghanistan and places like that. So they get
Right.
together, they dialogue, they identify what they regard as being the major themes, overarching themes like gender issue, racism issues, and so on. And then specific groups of countries have special needs that they need to have catered for. So having identified this, the member states, we're demand driven, having identified these needs and these requirements and areas for assistance, it's then the job of UNESCO staff to help operationalize the things that they regard as important.
Okay.
Um, so, for example, in my area, I was particularly concerned with the reform of secondary education because many countries felt that secondary education shouldn't just be academic education to prepare people for university entrance or academic study at the post secondary level. It should be something which has a value in its own right and prepares people who don't want to go on to higher education, but who want to, in fact, just improve their repertoire of skills and knowledge and then achieve areas of employment that interest them.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are very important issues which permeate everything, like the issue of gender in education. The fact that in many countries, women have been disadvantaged, they've been excluded from many programs, they haven't been given the same opportunities as boys and men. So all of these things have to be addressed. And then what happens is that governments invite us to go to their country to diagnose the situation, to help develop in dialogue with the local policymakers and practitioners, to dialogue and work out appropriate areas of action to help address the issues being concerned. And then UNESCO itself will organise international meetings to examine these areas in greater detail. So, for example, one of the big issues was the vocationalisation of education at all levels, trying
Right.
to look at how education can better prepare people to gain useful employment and be effective in their work and have high quality inputs. So, for example, I organised a meeting at the University of Oxford looking at the vocationalisation of higher education, and countries came from all over the world to dialogue about this, to look at what could be done, what were the needs, what were the possible areas of action. I organised meetings on gender issues in education. Again, countries coming together to actually discuss these things, to share their experience, give case studies, and then to look at how they can collaborate. So, one of the things that we try to emphasise across our programs in education is educational innovation for development. What innovations can we adopt to help improve the situation? And what we find is that what works in one country, that might be very successful in one country, can, with some adaptation for the local context, also be used in other countries. So countries want to explore innovations, look at how they can modify them. And the other thing they want to do is look at best practices or the most promising practices that really work and learn from each other and then try and modify their systems of education and schooling accordingly. So you can see
Okay.
it's very much to do with collaboration, cooperation, partnerships, and it isn't just government. It's also having to mobilize civil society and having to look at collaboration with business firms, industry, and so on,
Mm-hmm.
so
Right.
that through partnerships we can be most effective in bringing about um, important change and development.
Okay. Excellent. So I do want to talk about, you've published quite a bit with Springer Nature, and you've got some pretty massive handbooks on international education and technical and vocational
Yes.
training, among other topics.
Yes. Hmm.
I'm wondering if you can kind of just give us an overview of some of those publications that you've done with Springer.
Sure. Well, one of the things that UNESCO is concerned with is also information dissemination,
Right.
publications, research, and things like that. So I've established during my time with UNESCO, I established two book series. One book series was on education for the changing world of work. And so far, there have been 34 volumes published in that book series. And a
Hmm.
second book series I established, and for which I'm co editor, is Education in the Asia Pacific region, looking at the major issues, concerns, and prospects. And we're about to publish the 55th book in that particular series. So that's been something which has been over many years. And there's a third book series, which has been recently established on education and sustainable development, which is a key topic currently, the greening
Right.
of economies and so on. So there are three book series with which I've been very closely associated and over many years and am still associated. And then I was instrumental in establishing two international handbooks. The biggest one is an international handbook, which took some years to develop when I was director of the UNESCO office in Bonn. And that involves 6 volumes and 198 chapters and about, I think it's 270 authors. So that was a very big project. And that handbook was one of the best sellers for Springer because it's extremely comprehensive. And then I did
Right.
another one. I did another one with a man called Felix Rauner, University of Bremen, looking at research on um, technical and vocational education and training, which was also very good. So these are all published by Springer Nature,
Hmm.
and they've been very well received within the international publishing community. Um, they're available, of course, in hard copy form on demand, but also many would actually download them from the internet.
Right.
So they're three major contributions, and really all of those contributions occurred during my time working for UNESCO. But then when I left UNESCO and started going back to work in universities, I was chair professor at the university in Hong Kong, the Education University of Hong Kong, and more recently a professor in Doha in Qatar. I've continued those book series. So I'm still adding volumes to both the Education in the Asia Pacific region series and also to the Education for the Changing World of Work.
Right.
Um, so that's been my major sort of area. I've also edited quite a few special issues of journals for Springer and also for other publishers as well. So it's been quite a comprehensive publications program.
Yeah. You just heard from Dr. Rupert Maclean, an internationally renowned researcher, author, and consultant on technical and vocational education and training. This episode was brought to you by Springer Nature. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk about how the role of teachers in teacher education are evolving to accommodate new vocational trends and the growing trend of businesses collaborating with higher education, particularly vocational training programs and research.
Well, in years gone by, the sort of schooling you had or education you had at secondary school, primary school, university was seen as a way of equipping you for life. And if you were educated or trained in a particular occupation, the expectation was that that would basically prepare you for that occupation for your whole working life. But now, because of the great areas of change and disruption and so on, it's no longer the case. You have to keep upgrading your knowledge and your skills. You can do that through attending courses. You can do it because your employer organises training and education sessions on the job, in service, on service, and so on. But also people have to take more responsibility for their own education, to learn the skills to actually be able to upgrade their skills by using the internet, through other means like that as well. And therefore, that really has changed the nature of education and schooling.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop us a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino. And all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.